in the third year of what the United Nations has dubbed the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The UN effort is designed to promote environmental work happening worldwide that fights ecosystem loss and degradation, helping combat climate change and biodiversity loss. Here at Michigan State University, Lars Brudvig and his team are doing their part. Lars is a professor of plant biology and a core faculty member of MSU's Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior, or EEB program. His research is in restoration ecology, which tries to understand how different components of a degraded ecosystem influence and respond to attempts to bring it back to health. Lars and his team are leading a variety of restoration projects, and their research is helping us understand why there can be such a variability in restoration outcomes. The goal of Lars' work is to help people working in restoration and conservation predict which direction their project will follow before they start, helping set more projects up for success. Realizing that goal will take time, but his work is making an impact. Lars and his team have published more than 25 papers during the decade in ecosystem restoration alone, and they've been cited more than 1,500 times this year. Today, Lars is joining us as we dive into his research and share some perspective on the challenges facing the people working to make our planet healthier. Hello and welcome.
Good morning.
How did you get into this line of research?
Yeah, it's a good question. So having been part of this field for, I don't know, maybe a bit over 2 decades, it's kind of fun to think back on how I got my start. And so I was developing my interests early in my career, and I was really excited about the application of ecological concepts and ideas to environmental problem solving. It's something I'm still really interested in. And restoration ecology was perfect for pursuing these interests. It's a science focusing on undoing environmental harm that people have done to natural ecosystems by working to put them back together. And I found this kind of really appealing maybe for a few reasons. One was, I could do research that might help to do good for nature. It's also a kind of a tinkering science where we get to try to understand how ecosystems work by reassembling them from their component pieces. And we have this analogy in restoration ecology about a clock. And the analogy goes that as a clockmaker, if you can take a clock apart and then put it back together from its component parts, and it at least functions still as a clock, it keeps time, then you understand how clocks work. And we have kind of a similar sort of idea in ecology if we take ecosystems apart, which we do all the time, by converting them to agricultural lands or places where we live, or forestry systems or pasturing systems, or so on and so forth. When we're done doing those things, if we can put them back together using our understanding of ecology, and then they work at least reasonably well, like they would have prior to being taken apart, then we understand how ecology works. And so that was really exciting to me as well. Now, when I was getting into restoration ecology, it was a pretty young field at the time, maybe a decade old in its formalization or so. And so it was an exciting time to get involved with restoration ecology as well. It was getting organized. It was showing really tremendous promise for confronting important conservation issues like biodiversity declines or the ecological consequences of climate change, which was really coming onto the radar at that time a couple of decades ago. And I was just really excited to contribute to the further development of this field of restoration ecology and try to help advance it through my research, and also do research that could help restoration practitioners do their jobs better.
There's a simple but difficult question written in big letters at the top of your website, which reads, "How do we restore degraded landscapes?" What's the best answer you can give to that question right now?
Yeah, you're right. This question sounds simple, but it's really not. I think there are a few ingredients, though, to this answer. And so, first of all, we have to understand the problem. We have to understand why and how ecosystems have become degraded or damaged by humans in the first place. Understanding how to put them back together requires understanding how they were taken apart initially. Second, I think we need a really strong coupling of fundamental science and practice. And so restoration ecology is this interesting field that has a science arm and a practice arm to it. The basic ecological science helps us understand how ecosystems are structured, how they change over time, why they support the certain species that they do at any given location, and so on. And restoration ecology is a chance to put this theory to work. And at the same time, provide real world tests of our theories in nature in all of its messy glory. So third, I think that evidence needs to lead the way, and this generally means research. So that's where I can fit in with the process. We need research that's relevant to practitioners. We're doing the science that's useful to them and also communicated clearly. And I think we need to think big. And so your question is about restoring landscapes. And landscapes are big areas, square kilometers. And doing restoration at these sorts of scales, which has not historically been the case, requires innovation in terms of our science and in terms of our practical skills. And so, for example, doing landscape scale restoration means that we need to bring ecological concepts to the fold that we don't often focus on in restoration ecology, like how we can facilitate plant and animal movements across really big areas with tools like habitat corridors, which is something that we also work on in our group. And finally, I think we need partnerships. We need partnerships between researchers and practitioners, between different conservation organizations, between groups doing restoration and the public, between policymakers and all the other constituent groups in restoration. There's a lot of different, stakeholders that can be involved, and restoring degraded landscapes it's just a really big job, and it's going to work best when we're working together.
What are the biggest obstacles to understanding why a restoration effort fails or doesn't go as planned?
Yeah, good question. So one thing I like to say is that the thing that we know with certainty going into a set of restoration projects is that no two of them will turn out the same. Now, we don't always know how they will turn out, but we know that no two will be the same in terms of which species live there, how many species live within them, and so on and so forth. And the reason for this is what ecologists call context dependencies. So these are sort of the reasons for this variation. Restoration sites can vary in almost unlimited ways, like the attributes of their soils or their proximity to populations of the species we want to support, like native wildflowers, or the species that might cause us headaches, like invasive species that can also become parts of our restored ecosystems. And so you asked this question about why restorations fail or don't go as planned, but I think we can also turn this question on its head and ask, well, why do they succeed, right? So let's make the glass half full. And I think all the same logic applies. By understanding the roles of important context dependencies, we can direct our effort towards those locations where the outcomes are most likely to be successful, or we can tailor our approaches to best help ensure that they do.
To help us understand how you do this type of research, I thought it might be helpful to talk through an example of one of your projects. In particular, you've been working on restoring longleaf pine savannas in the southeastern US for over a decade. Can you tell us a little bit more about the ecosystem, how you're restoring it, and what you're learning from it?
Yeah, so if you haven't had an opportunity to visit a longleaf pine savanna, I think you should. These are really spectacular ecosystems. They once stretched from Virginia to Texas and down into peninsular Florida, and they're part of what's known as the Southeastern Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. And so this is one of the recognized biodiversity hotspots in the world. And there's two reasons that an area will get recognized as a biodiversity hotspot. One is that it supports tremendous amounts of biodiversity. And the second is that it's imperiled. And so longleaf pine savannas are part of this biodiversity hotspot in the southeastern United States. And think about park-like ecosystems with scattered longleaf pine trees and this incredibly diverse ground layer or understory of native grasses, sedges, wildflowers, small shrubs. And the diversity is really kind of through the roof. There can be sites that have 40 species of plants per square meter on average. And across longleaf pine savannas in the southeastern United States, there are 900 species of plants that are what we call endemic. And so they live there and only there naturally, nowhere else in the world. And so tremendous diversity from small to really big spatial scales. Now, I mentioned there's two parts to being a biodiversity hotspot. There's the biodiversity, and then there's the imperilment, the threats. And longleaf pine savannas are now really rare. We think about 3% of their historical range is left. And the reason is that people have recently, since European colonization, converted them to farms and tree plantations and other uses. And they've also suppressed fire. And this is one of the most fire-frequented places on Earth. The soils are incredibly sandy. Things dry out really fast. There's high incidence of lightning strikes because of thunderstorms. And we think historically, longleaf pine savannas would have had fires run through the ground layer, not burning up the trees, but just through the ground layer every 1 to 3 years or so. And that maintains these park-like environments and supports the high levels of biodiversity within them. So we've been working with the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Defense for over a decade to understand how we can best bring back this key component of longleaf pine savannas, the diverse ground layer. What we've learned is that there's a key bottleneck, and that's the arrival of native seeds of plant species that naturally live in the ground layer after a site has been disturbed. For example, after it's been used as a farm field and then farming is stopped. And this is owing to the rarity of many of these ground layer plant species across most landscapes. Now, fortunately, there's a pretty simple solution. We can add seeds. So we can kind of become the seed dispersers by harvesting seeds of native plants from the places that they grow and then scattering them on the ground in the places that we want to restore. And these seed sowings or seed additions work best, we've learned, when longleaf pine sites are maintained by fires. So not too surprising there. That's this, again, really important natural process within the ecosystem. And so the seed additions work best when there's low densities of trees and not too much pine needle buildup on the ground. And we think it forms a physical barrier for the seeds and the plants that might grow there. We also have learned, though, that these seed additions work best in years when the climate is cooler and when it rains more. And so there's really important implications in the face of a changing climate going forward. And there's some additional good news. So once these plants establish, they're highly likely to persist over time. And we know this by following plots where we've conducted these seed additions for a number of years after we've done them. And so once these plants reestablish, they are highly likely to persist and promote the long-term restoration of the longleaf pine savanna ecosystem.
Obviously, your work won't stop when the decade in ecosystem restoration ends in 2030, but still an interesting milestone to think about. What are the goals you like to accomplish or questions you'd like to answer by the end of that decade?
So I'd like to make important progress on kind of a frontier type issue in restoration ecology, and that's prediction. And so, like I mentioned earlier, restoration outcomes are highly variable. We can conduct restoration projects on seemingly similar sites using seemingly similar methods and get a wide variety of outcomes. And importantly, some of those we would class as being highly successful and others not so much, even maybe outright failures. Because of this, some people have even argued that restoration outcomes are unpredictable. And I disagree with this. What I think is that by better understanding of why restoration outcomes vary, we can develop the capacity to predict these outcomes based off of measurable attributes of sites, things like the aspects of their soils or the locations of natural areas around sites, details of the restoration plan as we're sort of envisioning implementing it. Now, my dream is that in the not too distant future, restoration practitioners might be able to reliably anticipate the outcomes of their project even before starting it. So they could go out to a site that they plan to restore, say an abandoned farm field, and they can take measurements of the soil and they can quantify the structure of the landscape around the site and find the locations of invasive species or native species around it and so on. And then they can sort of know with some degree of certainty, kind of like a weather forecast, how that restoration project will turn out. Now, we have work to do, but we're making progress. And our group in particular is developing and testing predictive restoration models in prairies, native grasslands here in Michigan, and also the longleaf pine savannas that I talked about before in South Carolina. And I look forward to continuing this area of focus for the rest of the decade and well, probably beyond that too.
During the introduction, I mentioned how productive your team has been over the last few years, publishing dozens of papers. And I wanted to ask you, what's been the key to that success?
So the key, maybe not too surprisingly, has been that I work with amazing teams. And have an amazing lab group here at Michigan State, and also wonderful collaborators here and outside the university. And just in the last year or so, we've had really exciting papers published that were led up by current or past lab group members, ranging from undergraduates to graduate students and postdocs. And I'm really proud of all of them. I'm particularly proud of the students who have published their work, including undergrads. I mean, think about it, students who were with us for as little as 3 months doing research projects, then continued to work on them to analyze the data and interpret the findings and write up papers and then go through the peer review process, and they've had their work published. And these individuals are now off doing great things in graduate school elsewhere on their own. So really amazing folks. We also have great collaborations with longtime collaborators that I've worked with for more than a decade in the longleaf pine research that I was talking about before, and also global collaborators. And so, for example, we work with a global collaboration called the Nutrient Network. This is a globally replicated experiment testing how nutrient availability and access by herbivores shape grasslands all around the world. There are over 150 different locations with different investigators that are conducting exactly the same experiment. It's all coordinated. And then they share their data and do really exciting science with this globally replicated experimental data set. We joined the Nutrient Network through plots at the Kellogg Biological Station about 10 years ago, and we've been fortunate to be able to maintain these plots there for 10 years now, alongside other long-term research at Kellogg Biological Station. And so it's been a team effort, absolutely, and I'm really thankful to be part of multiple really great teams doing exciting research.
In closing, if people would like to stay up to date on you or your research, what is the best way for them to do that?
So I really enjoy communicating our research projects and findings through social media posts. I have a new account now at Blue Sky, and you can find me there at Lars-Brudvig.
Well, this has been great, and I'd like to thank you for joining me today.